Hey everybody, I'm Charlene. I think most of you know me in the room, and I think most of you know what SAVAC is, but just if you don't, I'm just going to give you a rundown of what we do. So SAVAC is a not-for-profit artist-run center. We've been around for 20 years as of last year, and we produce, disseminate, create, exhibit contemporary, critical South Asian art. And we've been doing this for 20 years in Toronto. We normally work without a gallery space, which is really interesting. And for better or worse, we partner with all kinds of organizations, from like educational institutions to festivals to artist-run centers and various other institutions. So it's kind of nice to work this way because we feel like we kind of like infiltrate the art system in Toronto with what we do. So SAVAC has been doing a lot of looking back lately, this being our 20th anniversary, and then Monitor celebrating its 10th anniversary. We're looking back not just at all the artists that have come through the organization, but also programmers, administrators, board members, many of whom are in the room today, who have gone on to have various other careers in arts admin, as artists as well, and with other organizations on this panel as well. So while looking back, we're also looking forward at what is to come for SAVAC in the future, while also holding true to our mandate and also recognizing the changes that have happened over the last 20 years, socially, politically, and of course economically within the art scene, but also within identity politics overall. And I think Monitor, with this in mind, we present Monitor Reruns, which is at A Space, which you can see around the corner. And what we wanted to do is look back at the Monitor archive, so of 10 years of Monitor, or 9 years rather, because this year is the 10 year, and reflect on SAVAC as an organization, while also reflecting on the works that have been presented in the program. And we asked Shai Heredia, who's a curator from Bangalore, and also founder of Experimenta, an experimental film festival in India, to curate Monitor Reruns, which is the Monitor archive show. And we've also asked Srimoyee Mitra, who used to be at SAVAC as the programming coordinator for 4 years prior to my arrival there, and is currently the curator of contemporary art at the Art Gallery of Windsor, and who's recently created the 3-part series Border Cultures, which usually starts in January and goes till April of every year. So in 2015 will be its 3rd iteration of the show. I also want to say that it's an award-winning show. So I just want to give you a rundown of what Monitor is. If many of you haven't come to the screening, it's our annual experimental film and video screening. We do it every year, usually around March or April. It takes place at various different venues around Toronto. We usually start it in Toronto, and then we take it on tour meaning like around the 401 belt, Kingston, Montreal, Ottawa, various places on that route. Monitor is interesting because it's Monitor and then South Asian experimental film and video. And this category of South Asian is quite loose in the way we interpret it. People will send in works. We get an external curator to curate this work. So every year Monitor looks different. That curator then shortlists it, and then a jury of local artists and curators will then shortlist that shortlist, and then we'll finalize the program. So it goes through many processes and sort of trying to keep it as not as insular as if it was just one person curating it, which I think is the strength of Monitor as well. And so this year, Monitor 10, which is on April 24th at Jackman Hall, is curated by Shai as well. And this is an interesting year for us, being our 10th year. And check out these posters. There's a whole bunch at A Space. Aliyah Pabani, our communications director, designed it. But anyway, just a preview of the program is here. It's really awesome. Show up to it. Okay, so I just want to contextualize why Shai and Srimoyee are sitting here. So Shai, like I said, being the curator, being a curator and a programmer, and also the founder of Experimenta, an experimental film festival India, was a really good way for us, for someone from the outside to look at our archives, also from someone who doesn't live in Canada to look at our archives. Because the archives are not just Canadian works, they're from all over, but we do have a heavily Canadian presence just because of our location in Toronto. And then we asked Srimoyee, who can give a little bit of a highlight of SAVAC's past and how Monitor came to be as well, because she was around when Monitor was sort of developing and becoming quite a big program, and was one of the first people to take it on tour. So just kind of having that context, and then myself being the current artistic director of SAVAC, and also someone who's like deeply indebted to Monitor for my career as well. So it's a nice mix to have the three of us on this panel. So I'm just gonna start off by asking Shai the question of why you chose to have these specific works curated at A Space from the 90 plus works that you saw from Monitor 1 to 9, and like why these ones are best to represent an entire program and an entire archive.
Okay. So when I got these, it was quite a task actually to engage with the archive, because there were 90 works and we were trying to get this across to India. So for that and for this whole thing as well, I need to thank Charlene and A Space and Images, because we had like films being sent across to India and like Skype calls, and this has been going on for like a couple of years. But in that process, actually, I think it was in Monitor 8, it was when Jacob... So Jacob Koczynski curated the Monitor 8 program, and I was going through all the films over the last 10 years, and there was one film that resonated with me in terms of my context of practice and work, and it was a film called Rearview Mirror by Panchal Mansaram, who is an artist, a filmmaker, an artist based in Toronto. There were many reasons why that work worked for me, also because it was filmed from between the 70s and then finished in 2008, I think it was, or 11. But in the film, there was, he had this engagement with Marshall McLuhan, and he explores that. There's his whole relationship to Toronto and his practice developing here. And in terms of the experimental film aesthetic, I thought it was quite special and interesting, because I have had some engagement with the context here and the community here, and that work resonated with me for many reasons. So I then went, we started looking at his work, and we found that it was in the 60s that he basically moved to Toronto and hosted a show called the East-West Happening, where he had this friendship with Marshall McLuhan, and he organized this show where he had like go-go girls and Kathak dancers, and it was this whole exploration of like hippie culture and Orientalism versus the West, and this whole idea of the global village, and to me it was really interesting, because he was responding to his socio-political reality in that sense, which was about this kind of utopian notion of the world, and this whole East-West kind of coming together idea. And then you had, looking at the contemporary work, I felt that it was similar in terms of artists responding to their socio-political realities, but that being very different in terms of the kinds of ideas that were explored, the kinds of thematics, whether it's like looking at migration or race or queerness, so it became an interesting conversation between Panchal Mansaram's work and the new work that was in the show. I also kind of made it specific I chose to kind of think about the work just in the Canadian context, because I felt like 90 works of like exploring South Asianness, or one couldn't speak to like this diasporic condition in this kind of mega sort of way, and I was like, I have some relationship in history to to the aesthetic of experimental film and video that grew out of the Canadian context, and let me just kind of engage with that. So all the work in the show is essentially Canadian. But what I would like to do, just to introduce you to the work of Panchal Mansaram. Okay, so the films that are in the show are not, Rearview Mirror is not a film, is not something that we've programmed, but we've programmed Intersect, which was the name of the East-West Happening, also the other name of the East-West Happening. That's a really special and interesting film, because it has Marshall McLuhan and Ravi Shankar, and you should check it out. And then, and the other work is a film called Devi Stuffed Goat with Pink Cloth. That was shot in Bombay and in other parts of Rajasthan. For me also, what was particularly interesting about Panchal Mansaram's work is his collage aesthetic. I've been doing some research with Films Division, which is the state propagandist unit of filmmaking from the 60s and 70s in India. There was a whole experimental film movement at the time, and the aesthetic was very much a collage aesthetic. So it's interesting to see how Panchal Mansaram kind of brought that aesthetic into his practice of filmmaking, which he actually taught himself while he was here in Toronto. He learned how to make films. And actually the films were shown at the funnel and stuff. So he was also connected to a community here. So so I'd just like to read out a text that will give you some kind of introduction into who Panchal Mansaram is, and his relationship to film. And I think that there are a lot of entry points through his work into the contemporary work and into thinking about the Monitor archive and what Monitor has been trying to do over the last 10 years. Okay, so this is a text that he's written. And he sent to me because I curated a program of his work at Experimenta this year. So it's titled Mansaram's Encounter with Indian Cinema. I was in grade 7 or 8 at Walter High School in Mount Abu in Rajasthan. In the summer, my father preferred to sleep outdoors in open by moving his bed outdoors. That was not the common practice in town, for fear of thieves and wild animals. It did not bother my dad. I decided to share the bed with him. It allowed me to sneak out to Garrison Cinema during the second show when my father was fast asleep. What a contrast then today. No company of friends, no snacks. Just me alone going through the solitary night on the road to the military area. A good half an hour walk, not a soul on the way. A bit scary. To cut the silence and fear, I would loudly sing Hindi songs while walking. Moving images fascinated me. After a few years, I was able to see the film Mehal, Kismat during a more reasonable time with local people in the Abu Road in the plains. That was real entertainment. I then studied art at the Sir J.J. School of Arts in Bombay, where I heard J. Krishnamurti lecturing under a tree in the school compound. That brought a turn in my life. Then at the State Academy of Fine Arts in Amsterdam, I met Constance, founder member of Cobra Group, and Sandberg, director of the Museum of Modern Art. During the stay, I was able to take side trips to Paris, where I met Akbar Padamsee, Raza, and Krishna Reddy. I took notes on viscosity printing at Hayter's atelier. On return to Amsterdam, I tried what I learned in Paris. These works are with the gallery in California and also in New York. In New York, I met Lakshmi Sihare, the ex-director of the National Gallery of Modern Art in New Delhi, Ravi Jain of Dhumimal Gallery. Geeta Kapoor was also there, whom I was not able to meet, but that was in 63-64. During 1960, we were in Calcutta. Bengali films by Ritik Ghatak and Satyajit Ray impressed me. I realized films are a good medium of art. I went to visit Satyajit Ray, encouraged by his background. He made the switch from an art director to a filmmaker. He was generous with his time to offer advice as to how he went about it. That was in 1960. It was here that I noticed that photographers were creating magic with the still camera. One of the photographers took our photos, which were processed by a professional lab. In the process, they were seen by many and liked. That landed us a job in an advertising film for Gold Flake cigarettes. It was not a run-of-the-mill advertising film. It was a 5-minute long travel film where an artist couple goes to Rajasthan on a painting trip. At the end of the day, the wife offers him a cigarette. One notices a yellow pack. At the end, these words appear on the screen. Gold Flake, wherever you go, they are good. Pandit Ravi Shankar offered to give the music for free. Shanti Chowdhury of Little Cinema Group, sorry, I don't know what that means. The sentence just ends. Life took us to New Delhi, then to Amsterdam with a scholarship to study art for a year, all expenses paid. We returned to India for a year when I met an English art critic doing his thesis on modern Indian art and folk art. He introduced me to Marshall McLuhan through an article in Life magazine. It so happened that we moved to Canada within a year. I got an opportunity to meet Marshall McLuhan. My art practice took another turn. I took a teaching job in a high school in Hamilton. For a couple of years, I joined Ryerson Institute to learn motion picture production in an extension program. I used to drive down to Toronto for 2 years to do this. I started making short experimental films in 16mm and started showing them too. The Funnel Theatre was one such facility where they would show films of its members. Later, video came. With that, briefly, I joined Charles Street Video. I found Ed Video in Guelph better for my temperament and needs. Last year, they made me a life member. I'm still working with them in their facility. My first film, Intersect, was shown at the Isaacs Gallery in Toronto at the East-West Happening created by me. in 1967. Rearview Mirror was shown at Cine City Theatre in Toronto in 74, followed by a showing in Bombay at the Mini Theatre and Dhumimal Gallery in New Delhi. The same year it was shown at the Centre for Performing Arts at Bhulawai Memorial Institute. My film on 16mm Devi stuffed goat in pink cloth was shown at the India House in New York in 1979, along with my art exhibit. Rearview Mirror was screened with a showing of art at Ed Video Gallery in 2011, then with Monitor 8 at various locations. While teaching art at high school, my students made experimental films on 8mm and Super 8. My latest video, Tea Sipping Man, is on Vimeo, and McLuhan Piazza is on YouTube. My life started with a push from Bollywood. When I got married to Tarunika, it was Prakash Chhabra of Indian Films, a young director from Punjab, who came to my rescue. He and his unit gave me all the help and blessings to make my films. My involvement with photography is another interesting story. Yeah. So I thought they'd be interesting to read because there are lots of things in there. Some things that you might get and some that you won't in terms of references that he makes. So with the work that we've been doing in India, we've also been looking at, as you may or may not know, the state of the institutional archives is it's really difficult to get any work out of there. And there's some of us who are trying to kind of dig out work, find artists who make work, and they have their films in their back rooms and stuff. And in that sense, it was interesting to find Panchal Mansaram's work because he was not the contemporary, but he was of a certain period where there were some of the most progressive, the most important avant-garde artists in India, like people like Akbar Padamsee, M.F. Hussain, for those of you who know these artists. They were around the same time and period also exploring film. And each of them kind of brought, we showed, at Experimenta this year, I showed a work by Akbar Padamsee, who's an extremely established artist. And then you had Panchal Mansaram's work, and Panchal Mansaram was kind of the outsider to Akbar Padamsee. But it was interesting to see how Panchal Mansaram kind of brings his collage aesthetic, which is he essentially, all his painting and his work has a collage aesthetic, which he brings into his film. You have Akbar Padamsee, who bring in his more like figurative aesthetic into his animation, or M.F. Hussain, who brings in his impressionistic style into his films. So it was interesting to see also Panchal Mansaram in this discourse. So those were the kind of the ways in which I was entering this work, through having some sense of the history, and it was interesting to look at how these works circulate, between here and between Toronto and India. So.
Sure. So first of all, thank you, Charlene and Images, for inviting me. It's great to be back for Monitor 10. My God, I feel like we talked about it when we get to Monitor 10, so it's great to be here. And a shout out to Oliver, because I think when I started at SAVAC, the first Monitor program that was the program that Oliver programmed. So I think I learned a lot through my work with him and through the years at SAVAC working on Monitor. So I guess to respond to that, first of all, I'd like to congratulate Shai on the way in which she has, or you have programmed Monitor reruns, and for sort of bringing Panchal Mansaram's films, setting that sort of as a backdrop to the rest of the work in the gallery, because I think, thinking about the collage aesthetic that you talk about in Mansaram's work, in his two-dimensional work, and the way in which it infiltrates into his moving images. I think the questions of collage echo through the entire program. So while, the longer, I'm forgetting the name, the Devi,
Stuffed goat with pink cloth.
Stuffed goat with pink cloth, I think what's, as well as intersect, there are, it's at a time, it's in the 60s, 20 years after India is an independent nation, I guess a newly, it is a moment of it is a bringing together sort of another view of modernity, thinking about how technologies are entering the mainstream through film and the camera, and we're talking about these, Akbar Padansi and MF Hussain being these really, the modern progressives, as they called it, right? Indian artists. And then from that moment, looking at the works by Nurjahan Alak, I guess what I was really struck by was, for instance, the way in which the market is portrayed in Devi, stuffed goat with pink cloth. I'm having a hard time with this one. Pink stuffed goat. Sorry. Is that something to
We could just call it Devi.
Okay.
Just call it stuffed goat.
Yeah.
Stuffed goat.
Or
sure.
pink. And the way in which the market enters in Nurjahan Alak's film in a very sort of, as she is talking about a trauma, the trauma of, when of a personal history, when her father and her sister were killed, and she enters this work through the painting of her father, who was also, at that moment of being a modern Pakistani painter. But her images of the markets are very painterly, almost a little bit romanticized, and it gives you this real notion of looking at the place through an artwork, right? And then of course you have her voice in the film, which also then echoes with, for me, to Aisha Hamid's film, where where again she's making a link between the colonial imperial histories of Europe with the increased deportations that happened to migrants in Europe by looking back at archives through her own narrative. What I really, what I liked about while watching Monitor reruns, and I was, watching Aisha's work, and when it goes to the dark black, the fade as it's looping, the reflection on the screen was seeking single white male. And it was at that moment when she's talking about, from people being disenfranchised to taking on a moment of defiance, right? Which I think that, seeking, watching it again after a number of years, I found it really, it's, still as powerful as it was, not just with the explosive music, within it, but also then thinking about how these films are distributed as a film that was, and I guess Vivek is here, so I should really turn it over to him to talk about it, but thinking about, taking the question of technology that comes up through Mansaram's films into then this, the world that we're living in today, grappling with the similar questions of marginalization and discrimination within, and what our contemporary culture looks like, and how we can have these conversations within, within the internet, and then through YouTube, and then of course the Torontonians, who are taking a complete spin-off of these stereotypes that that racialized South Asian bodies are subjected to, but perhaps from the inside, and also critiquing the rigidities within the community. So so I think.
No, that's a nice connection between all the films, and I think for what's nice to see between the linkages between the film formally as well as thematically is that for Vivek's film Seeking Single White Male and the Torontonians film, which is called How to Be a Brown Teen, they just take the piss. Like, that is what they do in the show. And I think we were talking about this with relation to Image's opening night film last night, where one of the filmmakers was like, they took cell phone footage from sailors. For those of you who weren't there, they took cell phone footage from sailors on boats to create this film, and all the sailors were just taking the piss. And this is a term that one of the filmmakers from camp spoke about, and I think that's really important to think about, because we take ourselves very seriously sometimes. I mean, especially when we talk about racialized art and discrimination and marginalization, especially within an experimental film and video framework. So it's nice to see these like younger people just kind of like shooting the shit and making fun of themselves while also critiquing larger systems, right? And so it's nice to think that you can do that using humor, and it's very important to do so. And also the performativity between the ways in which the Torontonians use their bodies on the camera, as well as Vivek, the way he uses his face mostly in his film to talk about like larger forms of systemic oppression and discrimination. So it was a nice pairing of the two. Also, they come from the similar years, but the Torontonians at that time were, I think, like 15, between 14 and 16, making this film. So it's nice to see different generations, and then link that to Mansaram, who is now 80, making stuff, but still has resonances, within everything that we are trying to do. I feel like perhaps this would be like an opening question to talk about the recurring themes that occur within Monitor, like themes of identity, themes of migration that we just see over and over again in all the Monitors. And I guess both of you have seen most of the Monitor films. You've seen them all. So perhaps, like, what does this tell us about experimental film and video artists within a South Asian framework, or any sort of diasporic framework in Canada, where themes of migration and diaspora and race and marginalization continue to come up over and over again?
Well, I mean, I think that it's quite natural to respond to your reality, no? I mean, and if you're dealing with like issues of race, there's bound to be a lot of work that's kind of coming from that space. The thing is that, I mean, when we pose that question in the text, the opening the text on the thing, the idea was not to actually kind of have an answer, the idea was really for us to reflect as to why that is a reality, and what is it about like our social context that is making people respond like that. So if issues of migration and race are, realities for people, and then, artists are responding to that, and then there's something for us as a flawed society to be thinking about, right? Mm-hmm. So, I mean, it was really kind of, that's really what the question was, more like a provocation, in that sense.
Yeah, I guess for me, just thinking about that question a little bit, I think the legacy of colonialism in Canada continues to echo through our generations, right? And the responsibility to decolonize has always, and artists have always taken that up. And I think whether you're South Asian or, non-South Asian or Indigenous or non-Indigenous, it's a responsibility that we all share, because it's the common culture that we all contribute to. And I think as, within the South Asian context, I suppose, one thing that we need to be cognizant of, obviously, is that is the legacy of being a migrant, or, perhaps a settler, right? And what does that mean in the work that we do? And how do we continue to interrogate that? And so as we continue to do that, of course, questions of identity and migration and marginalization will continue to be important themes, especially at a time when more and more people are being deported, even though, we're extremely connected with all our Wi-Fi gadgets, but as Aisha says in her response in the text here, that these are pertinent issues, and they will hopefully continue to recur, for us to find solutions together. or ways forward rather than solutions.
I think it's interesting for when looking back at the Monitor programs from 1 to 9 and thinking about these recurring themes, also thinking about form, how and why certain artists choose this type of form, this type of nonlinear experimental style filmmaking and video making form to put forth these narratives, right? And why is that important? And I guess we've all seen enough work where, like, how does the form inform the content in this case anyway? Perhaps we could ask Vivek, because he's here. Well, just when you were thinking about making this film about like queerness and seeking single white male and your experience of racism within queer spaces, why did you choose this particular format to do so instead of anything else? You know, I know that's a pretty big question, but.
Yeah, I mean, I wish I had a really genius answer. Honestly, that was the first short film I'd ever made. And I knew I wanted something that looked like I had an idea of what I wanted it to look like, and I found software that enabled me to, you know, take what was in my head and make something. So it was like Final Cut Motion, and I just like plugged in what I wanted to plug it in, and yeah. So I mean, I think that often it's about trying to take whatever theme it is that you're navigating and what medium is best going to support it. And for whatever reason, you know, I'm a writer and I'm a musician, and those two mediums didn't feel like it would convey what I wanted to convey. So I felt like video art in some way was going to be able to go.
No, I just want to say that, I mean, I think what I like about like all the work in the show is that there's a kind of very personal and I mean, you know, to use the word raw, but obviously in a kind of sophisticated sort of way, quality. It's like an exploration of, I mean, it's, you know, and it's, there's something really fresh about all the work actually, even like Mansaram, you know. There's an exploration that's happening with the medium, which is kind of exciting, you know, to see. Like even with the Torontonians video, it's kind of like a community video project, but it's a work, you know. So yeah.
Sure. I think perhaps we could open the floor up for people who have questions for Shai, Srimoyee, or Vivek, or myself about Monitor as well.
I guess everyone needs to see the show.
Yeah.
Tie in with the tour.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I always wondered about that title, Monitor. Do you know about that?
I'm not sure.
Yes,
I inherited
right.
Monitor. I have no idea how the title came out.
No, Srimoyee, do you know?
Well, maybe it's about monitoring. Maybe it's about inventory.
Sure.
Yeah.
Possible.
Any other questions? Yeah. No.
Well, I mean, I got a sneak peek of the show, so maybe I have an advantage in that sense. But what I think is really interesting about the show is the intergenerationalness of it. But the thing that I found like maybe challenging in some way was the strength of McLuhan's voice, like Marshall McLuhan's voice in shape. Well, I guess because of his influence on Mansaram, but like there was a bit of a resonance of McLuhan kind of speaking at that and not with in the way that he like. There's a piece where there's like him recorded talking about things, and I was wondering if you guys could speak a little bit about that and what the resonance of that is, because one of the things that strikes me is that the later work, like, McLuhan is irrelevant in so many ways to that. So like there's a possibility where he could, like, I think the canon would imagine that he would be a kind of father figure in creating this East-West narrative that should prevail the works, but in reality, like the works are almost, they ignore that kind of, that possibility of a past narrative to structure how artists take up their works, you know, over the last 10 years of filmmaking in the genre. So,
So the McLuhan, you know, I looked at some other stuff with McLuhan speaking in interviews. He seems to like talk down to everybody. So you know, there's just this quality. But the thing is that it's also, I guess it also depends on where you're looking at it from. Like in the Indian context, when I showed the work, McLuhan was in many ways kind of irrelevant, you know. It was really about looking at Mansaram and his practice and his aesthetic and, you know, how interesting that was really. And I suppose from this context, you would maybe read McLuhan's voice as kind of significant to, yeah. I mean, you know, he had this obsessive relationship with McLuhan, so. But I think it's interesting because in that interview, that audio interview, there's a lot there that, you know, a lot of things that McLuhan says that's like also super problematic, you know. And I think that that's really revealing, and you know, you can like turn that whole interview on its head, you know. And Mansaram's like quietness says a lot actually to like the problematics of what McLuhan is saying. So yeah, so I think if you just, you know, looked at it differently. Yeah.
Any other thoughts or questions? Oh, sorry.
I don't know if this was asked already. So this was looking back, but in terms of looking forward, where do you guys see South Asian experimental film going?
I'll let you respond.
It's going anywhere you want to. I don't know.
In terms
Okay,
of
no.
themes
I mean, no. That's like too big a question. But I mean, let me ask you, in terms of Monitor specifically, actually, because this is something that we've talked about.
Yeah.
And I think that there's stuff there that we, you know, need to think about, like, you know, based on what Monitor has been doing and the kind of representation and issues that you've been dealing with, and where is it going to go from now? I mean, it's not something that you have to kind of decide, but it's obviously things that to think about, because it is the 10-year mark, and you know, it's kind of a big deal in some sense, and it is a different like time and space that we're in.
Yeah.
So yeah.
I think for us, I mean, and we've had many conversations at SAVAC on various different levels talking about where we want Monitor to go, and I think the 10-year mark allows us to think about for Monitor 11 what we would want, and I think we all are interested in touring it in South Asia at various other artist-run centers and various other arts organizations that we have made contact with over the years, just of working with people. And I think for this, it allows us to have more transnational conversations, more than what we already have with this program. And I think that is a really nice thing for SAVAC to do, because like I said, 20 years of running an organization in Toronto and partnering with Canadian institutions, we also have done many things overseas and in various other places, but it would be nice to have these conversations now, like on the subcontinent, right? And so Monitor, just technically being an easy program to take with us, because we just take like a hard drive or a DVD or whatever and tour it, it allows us to sort of talk about SAVAC as an organization and what we are trying to do, especially when it comes to like this idea of South Asian and what it means to be South Asian. And this is something that we talk about, and we have talked about for years and years at SAVAC, even prior to my arrival there. And Monitor 9, which was the last program curated by Nahed Mansoor, was very much in line with opening up this idea of South Asian. Like, is it a geographic context? We would say no. What does it mean to be South Asian? You know, and by doing that, we had films ranging from like Nigeria to Thailand and sort of everything in between. And that allowed us to talk about things more thematically, how culture flows, how ideas move that stem beyond just geographic boundaries. And I think this is what we're trying to do with SAVAC. And I think Monitor is a nice way for us to sort of like talk about that in this way. Anything else you want to add?
Well, I'm just curious to see, like, when it goes to South Asia, because context is everything.
Sure.
I think for us, we've noted that again and again with the work that we show, that it depends on the level of knowledge that you have and the relationship that you develop with the aesthetic. So to me, I'm very curious to see how Monitor is going to be perceived in South Asia, especially when there's a bit of a hang-up of coming from the diaspora and going back to South Asia. I think there's always a bit of a, oh no, I don't know, there's nervousness that occurs. And so I'm very curious to see like how all of that will play out for the next year.
I just wanted to say actually, I mean, I was interested to ask anyone in the room, maybe Chris, I don't know, I mean, because I feel like Panchal Mansaram's work has kind of been out there for a while, and especially with the film and video stuff. And it's interesting that it doesn't seem like it's shown in any kind of experimental film context, the work. And his work seems kind of out there in terms of, in some ways, like he has shows at, wherever, in Mississauga and Ed Video and things. But it's interesting that, he's kind of, you don't see the work at all. And I was wondering what happens with that kind of like, how do I...
Who distributes his work?
Ed Video.
Ed Video.
Yeah.
Yeah. And there's like 3-4 films, and it's, it's like Pablo, and nobody knew the work. And none of, I mean, Jacob actually saw the new work that Panchal Mansaram had sent in, which was 2011, really.
I wasn't aware that they really distributed. I wasn't aware that Ed Video.
I think they just, everything we've gotten from Ed Video, like all his stuff that we have, Ed Video sends to us. So in that way, they act as a distributor.
I mean, I think that's actually normal. People who make a small body of work over a long period of time and who don't keep it in distribution, how is somebody going to fund it? There's many artists in the same position who have some amount of work, but who, they're just haven't built up enough of a career to be visible over a long period of time.
But I think Mansaram is an interesting character because it's not that he doesn't have a large body of work, it's that his films are not, he doesn't have that many films, but he has work stemming over 40 years that we recently went to his house to get some things, and just, they're all just there in his basement. And he's done stuff kind of ranging from like tapestry to various types of collage work to video to film to, like he said in the 80s he was involved with the Xerox movement in New York. So like all kinds of very different things. But it's interesting to think about visibility because I had never heard of him till he submitted work to Monitor, which was like 2 years ago, right? And then from there we sort of discovered this archive of this guy. Sorry, Ingrid.
I was just wondering when we went to see his work, and his basement is packed. He's so prolific. And I think the thing that was striking to me after conversing with him is, he showed us posters that he was commissioned by Heredia to create, and all of these really like gold flake. I had no idea he did work with gold flake, which is I think interesting because he's marginalized in both spaces, and I think that's a diasporic problem. Is that like in terms of he won't be spoken in the same breath as Akbar. He won't in India, even though he's of that generation and has produced some really interesting work. And here, he comes here, and again, like I find it frustrating that people always say, oh, he met McLuhan, as if it's not that McLuhan met him. Right. From what I can see, they influenced each other. It was a dialogue, it was a conversation. The idea of global village didn't come out of anywhere. It was through a collaboration by somebody who was from the global south. And I think, for me, like it just illuminates this problem that we have in terms of not being recognized. Like I think now he's so late in his career and he's had a few retrospectives of the show, but it's been 40 years of making work in Canada that he's finally being recognized. So it's a contextual problem. It's also like when you see his work, it's so fresh and it's so contemporary, and he was in my mind so ahead of his time in terms of what the methods he employed and so on and so forth. So I think it's complicated.
It's also interesting because in the Indian context, like you were saying, I mean, he was very much the outsider. And his work is equal to, if not better, than what Hussain made or what Akbar Padamsee made. But we have like a caste system in that sense of like there's a certain elite whose work gets out there, and then there's the outsiders and the migrants whose work everybody. I talked about his work recently at a film conference, and it was kind of problematic the way people were engaging with him, and they were like, oh yes, we remember him. And I was like, his work is really interesting. And then you had like these art historians being like, maybe we should look at his work, And it was acquired in the early 80s. One of his films was acquired by the National Gallery of Modern Art, which nobody talks about in the Indian context. So it's kind of interesting how there's this marginalization, like you're saying. you know, in terms of the artist community in a general sense.
Is there a question on this side? Do you remember?
Did you have a question? No.
Okay,
Oh, no. Oh, I thought you had your hand up.
I think we should wrap up and actually go see the show, and then. Oh, sorry,
I
Chris.
just wanted to say, remind people about one thing. All of the previous 9 programs of Monitor are available for viewing at VTape during the festival. So just upstairs, 4th floor, VTape has programs 1 through 9 available just to come in during opening hours and watch if you're interested. So the whole program.
Yeah, you should check that out. And also, so let's head to A Space. There'll be food by our in-house chef, Latigra. There's going to be rerun style food there, and a couple of the artists will be there. We'll be there. We can continue this conversation. I also want to again highlight that Monitor 10 is on April 24th at Jackman Hall. Please come. It's an awesome program curated by Shai. She'll be there again. We can have another conversation after and just celebrate this like 10 years of this thing that we have been building for so long. Okay, thank you all for coming. I appreciate it.